Bonjour à tous les participants. So this is the only sentence that I can speak in French. I'm so sorry. Also, if I'm Italian, so and France is so close, so I never studied French. I studied English and Spanish. So, and unfortunately, so the science is in English, and it is more simple to speak in English about science. So after this long presentation that Emma gave introducing me, so maybe you realize that I'm a bit old. So time to retire. So anyway, today we will speak about the topic that she introduced you. So just let me see if it works. No? What happened? Now it works. Okay, so this is a short summary of what I'm doing now, because this is my fourth life, as I'm used to say, but currently I'm working in this type of stuff, and it is a pleasure to thank Emma, Virginie, and Guillaume, I pronounce correctly, and Guillaume, that are involved in this European project that we are going to present tomorrow. Anyway, so, and for sure I have to thank the French Society of Sports Psychology, and in particular Alexis, whom I share funny moments in FEPSAC, being him in the managing council. So thank you very much for inviting me to present today this talk. So we shift directly to English. So this is the English title of my presentation. So usually when we speak about injury, we speak about post-intervention, after injury, thinking about the psychological stuff. But today I will concentrate on the prevention, and in particular how we can manage stress recovery balance to avoid injury, non-contact injury in this case. So because it is a very important topic, and we can say a lot of things from a psychological point of view, and today I will try to embed psychology inside physiology, because we have to think that psychology is embedded in physiology, and if we want to speak with strength and conditioning trainer, coaches, sports scientists in general, we need to speak their language and try to show what we can add in their work daily, because this is the only way from a practice point of view, so to improve our intervention in sport, implementing sports psychology. So I would like to start with this clip that introduces what can happen in terms also of very important issues that derive from an imbalanced stress recovery. So unfortunately, it is in English. I hope that you can get the main points, but it is not so difficult. It is quite clear also if it is an American clip.
After a successful freshman campaign, including a team podium finish in cross country, 4 individual Big Ten titles, and 3 All-American citations, I was riding a high that seemed untouchable. I was on top of the world. As accolades on the track and cross-country courses piled up, I felt more and more comfortable defining myself in terms of my running. It was my identity, the fact of being who I was. But then it started to take. A small limp erupted into a full fracture in my foot. With the #1 team ranking, Michigan women's cross country was supposed to challenge for the national title, and I was supposed to help lead them. For the first time in my tenure at Michigan, I was unable to do what I was supposed to do. Instead, I remained back home in Ann Arbor, my identity torn away from my physical being. I was miserable, depressed, and I hurt those closest to me. I wanted desperately to escape the sadness that overwhelmed every minute of every day. But how could I escape this agony if all I was running? And I couldn't run.
So, as you could see, there are a lot of issues that can be related to the training process, and what we can do as a sports psychologist is to help the coaches and the strength and conditioning trainer to implement some specific interventions that are typical in sports psychology. And you have an expert here in the audience, Sylvain Laborde, a good friend also of mine, that explained many times the sympathetic-parasympathetic balance, for instance, which is one of the issues that we have to take care. So, as you could see, injury can have very negative side effects, like the influence on mental health. So if we work on the prevention, we can work properly. And also recently, I didn't include this paper on my presentation, but recently the International Olympic Committee published an interesting paper about that and about some frameworks on how to prevent injury. So, we have to think about stress recovery, and particularly putting our focus and emphasis on recovery. And this is why, for instance, some years ago, with a group of colleagues coming from different fields, so sports science, psychology, physiology, and so on, we published this consensus statement about recovering performance. And also we contributed in a book that has been published by Kellman and Beckman, so in 2018, if I remember well. So the focus is on recovery, but the focus is on the entire process. So here there is a summary of the different constructs that we tried to investigate in that consensus statement, trying to explain how these different constructs of stress recovery can be defined in sports setting, and what are the psychological features of these different concepts. I do not want to go in deep on these, but you have just a summary, and I will leave my presentation to Emma, so the French Society transforming in PDF can share without any problem with the members, so the presentation, there is no problem about that. And so you can have a look again to it. So I would like to start speaking about this topic, starting from the stress. So I think that everyone that studied sports science or psychology inside the room, so know very well this type of constructs, and know very well, in particular, the biological part of stress and the psychological part of stress. So from a biological point of view, stress is the physiological adaptation to mobilize energy to face different situations through the day. But from a psychological perspective, it depends on the relation between the person's interests, the environment, and the coping skill. So we have to think about appraisal and coping, which is one of the main topics in psychology. And thinking about stress, so we know very well the SAIL model, in which it is rooted and based also the fight or flight sentence. But what is important is that in this general adaptation syndrome model by SAIL, there is an alarm phase in which we have a decrease in our performances, we have some symptoms, and this is the alarm that something is not going the right direction in terms of stress. Then we have a second phase in which we try to resist to this type of stress and cope and face the stress in some way. But at a certain point, we can reach the exhaustion. And when we reach the exhaustion, this starts becoming a big issue, obviously, because we can perceive fatigue, so we perceive the stress in the negative way, and so on, so on. So it is not just an eustress, but it is also a distress at that point. So, thinking about sports science, so the training methodology is based on the general adaptation syndrome model. So, and what we try to do in sports science is to implement training load, which is a stressor in some way, and try to see how the athletes respond to this type of stress, and try to put the next training load in the right moment to increase their performance and not just go into a decreased performance. So in this case, we have some acute responses and the perception of fatigue, then we need some recovery. And we need to balance very well the time, the delay of recovery, and so on, to have an adaptation and to avoid to go in this very problematic state, which is overtraining, which is, so as you probably know, when an athlete is in overtraining and there is a diagnosis of overtraining, so the athletes need to be stopped by the physicians, and the athlete has to stop at least 40 days, so which is a big issue for the athletes that are preparing, for instance, the Olympics in some way. So what we do is to balance load and recovery, so stress in other terms, and recovery, to increase their capacity. And this is an important point, because so we can go also in the other way around, which is worst. So we are not able to administer the right load to go in this way, and we just go in this way. We can have this type of stuff, but we need at a certain point to go up. So if we start going down again, we reduce the ability to accept the load and increase the susceptibility to injury. And this is the main point, the link between stress recovery balance and injury, and how we should prevent injury in this way. To better understand this process, I show you this model coming from some friends. Samuele Marcora and Franco Impellizzeri are very close friends of mine, and with other people, for instance, Aaron Coates, which is another great sports scientist, they developed this model to understand what are the training effects. So, and what is interesting is that they define the acute and the chronic part, both in positive and negative ways, that can have an effect on the sport performance outcomes going in this direction if the intervention is correct, or going in this direction if the intervention is not proper. And the main problem is not here, because we can have functional overreaching in the planning, in the periodization training. But when we have non-functional overreaching or overtraining, this can be a big issue in the training. And we need to know what to implement from a psychological point of view. And here you have your president, that is an expert in sports psychological training periodization in rugby, for instance. So he developed a lot of stuff in this way and can teach a lot about that. So thinking about this model, we have to think about the stress recovery balance and the well-being of the athletes, not going in the wrong direction that I showed you in the clip before. And we can have also an effect on injuries, for instance. So, and this is the side effect. But there is something in this model, there are two things in this model that are not implemented. The first one is in between functional and non-functional overreaching, and it is defined as under-recovery. Under-recovery is a very important concept that is determinant for our intervention in sports psychology. What is under-recovery? So under-recovery is not well defined. And here there is a definition that was provided by Michael Kellman, and he said that under-recovery and non-functional overreaching represent two closely related thoughts, slightly different concepts. While under-recovery appears to delineate a broader condition of insufficient recovery in reaction to general stress, Moisen characterized non-functional overreaching as training-specific negative psychological and hormonal alterations and subsequent decreased performance. Continuous under-recovery and non-functional overreaching often serve as a precursor for the overtraining syndrome. So it is clear the concept of NFO, but it is not so clear and so investigated the concept of under-recovery. And someone defined also the under-recovery trap, for instance, in a paper in 2020. So this is an important issue. And how we could see if we have athletes in under-recovery. So we tried to speak about that and define this in the book chapter that a group of us, led by Leslie Podolog and my former students, tried to define in this chapter. And in this chapter, we discussed the antecedents, the implication, and the prevention strategies for under-recovery. And I will speak about, during my presentation, some of these strategies. So, thinking about the psychological part, under-recovery is characterized in terms of symptoms from a reduced stress tolerance, sleep disturbance, lack of energy, phases of emotional disturbances. So as you can see, there are a lot of constructs in which we can provide support to the athletes and to the coaches. But what is important is that in terms of intervention, we can have short-term intervention like relaxation or other recovery techniques that I will discuss during my talk. And in terms of long terms, we need rest periods of days and weeks. So, as you probably read some papers during last years about the psychology of rest, for instance. So it is not just a question of recovery and stress recovery balance, but it is also a question of rest. So to have a good rest. And the recent literature investigates a lot the quality of sleeps, for instance, and how to implement the quality of sleep in terms of rest, for instance, or how much rest they need after a period, a microcycle of intervention in terms of sport science periodization. So this is what we can do. And here you have a summary of the different constructs that were presented in the model, so under recovery, non-functional overreaching, and overtraining. And as you can see here, there are a lot of important stuff that can keep our attention in terms of psychological intervention. So, but it is not well described and everything, because the most important part is this one, the individual and contextual factors, and we are experts in this one. This is why I wrote with some colleagues a commentary to this paper trying to better explain what are the psychological constructs that should be implemented in this model. And particularly, so we focused on three main concepts. So, what is the contribution of psychological constructs and measures to this framework? So what we can do, what are the measures that we can implement? So for instance, so in this type of literature, there are a lot of psychological measures and scale that are used by sport scientists. For instance, there is a very clinical instrument which is profile of mood states, the POMS, that is administered from non-specialists, for instance, in the field, and sometimes they are not completely aware of the meaning of these instruments that comes from the clinical psychology. But also, are sport scientists aware of the distinction between trait and state measures? So, for instance, state anxiety, trait anxiety, and so on. So sometimes they are not completely aware of that. We can help teaching to the coaches and strength and conditioning training what is this different and more in deep, for instance, because sometimes they can better understand the report that we can give. So when we collect measure about the anxiety of the athletes, for instance. And the last one, and this is the one in which I would like to concentrate today, it is the difference between the homeostatic model and the SAIL model. The general adaptation syndrome is based on an homeostatic biological model and the allostatic perspective, because the allostatic perspective is completely different. And this is something that I would like to push a lot in sports science, to have a different perspective, also because if we take an allostatic perspective, we can provide a lot of support to the athletes as a sports psychologist. So, but how we can differentiate between these two terms? So, homeostasis and allostasis. So, going back to the model, homeostasis is related to the acute positive and negative part of the training effect. Allostasis is more related to the chronic part. So, now we started to have an idea on where we can work with these two different concepts. And to better understand the difference between homeostasis and allostasis, I like to show you this video that comes from Sapolsky. Sapolsky is an American scientist that studied a lot this type of concept and published this very nice book, Why Zebra Don't Get Ulcers and Humans Have. This type. So have a look at this clip, because so you can better understand without many words the difference between homeostasis and allostasis.
If you're a normal mammal, what stress is about is 3 minutes of screaming terror on the savannah, after which it's either over with or you're over with.
For a few weeks every year or so, Sapolsky shifts his lab to a place more than 9,000 miles away on the plains of the Masai Mara Reserve in Kenya, East Africa.
You live in a place like this, you're a baboon, and you only have to spend about 3 hours a day getting your calories. And if you only have to work 3 hours a day, you got 9 hours of free time every day to devote to making somebody else just miserable. They're not being stressed by lions chasing them all the time. They're being stressed by each other. They're being stressed by social and psychological tumult invented by their own species. They're a perfect model for westernized stress-related disease. Because what stress is about is somebody is very intent on eating you, or you are very intent on eating somebody, and there's an immediate crisis going on.
When you run for your life, basics are all that matter. Lungs work overtime to pump mammoth quantities of oxygen into the bloodstream. The heart races to pump that oxygen throughout the body, so muscles respond instantly.
You need your blood pressure up to deliver that energy. You need to turn off anything that's not essential. Growth, reproduction, you're running for your life. This is no time to ovulate. Tissue repair, all that sort of thing. Do it later if there is a later.
When the zebra escapes, its stress response shuts down. But human beings can't seem to find their off switch.
We turn on the exact same stress response for purely psychological states, thinking about the ozone layer, the taxes coming up, mortality, 30-year mortgages. We turn on the same stress response, and the key difference there is we're not doing it for a real physiological reason, and we're doing it nonstop. after a while, the stress response is more damaging than the stressor itself, because the stressor is some psychological nonsense that you're falling for. No zebra on earth running for its life would understand why fear of speaking in public would cause you to secrete the same hormones that it's doing at that point to save its life.
So probably now you have a better idea of the difference between homeostasis and allostasis. And as you could see, the flight-fight reaction is well explained with animals, but not at the same level with humans, because humans have this part, and this is the part that is taken into consideration in the allostasis process. I remember, for instance, a few years ago, I mentioned this example also a couple of weeks ago in Bratislava with the Slovak Association of Sports Psychology. So a few years ago, I was following as a sports psychologist the Pescara team, which is a team close to the university where I work, and it was in the second division at that time, and we were not able to understand why an athlete was not able to manage the load, or the training load that he had, because from a physical point of view he was perfect, but there was something that created wrong stress responses to him, and he was not able to recover from the training session, for instance. In the end, we realized that it was a social aspect. He was a young one in the first team, 20 years old, so attending a private school, and he had some issues in the school that he was bringing to the training, and this is this prior knowledge and prediction that can affect this type of variable control in the homeostasis. So this is what allostatic model can bring, and this is where we can support our teams as psychologists, for instance. So, as you can see, thinking about allostasis, we can have a contribution from different sciences: biochemistry, human behavior, psychology, physiology, coaching, and so on. If this is the allostatic model of the stress recovery balance, when we think about an allostatic model, we can have this type of stuff. So we have lower resources, and then the expectation and the demands need to be different from here. So we have to assess very well and monitor how our athletes are, also before the training sessions, to provide suggestion to the coach or the strength and conditioning trainer how to cope with these specific athletes, having an idiosyncratic perspective. So, and not a nomothetic perspective, which is very important as a psychologist. So, and the allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body, which accumulates as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress. And this is what happened to the athletes. They have repeated stress that can become chronic. So this is what we can do as a sports psychologist, supporting, assessing the stress recovery balance continuously, mainly with psychological measure or instruments, because they are more simple than doing lab stuff. In this perspective, so we have to change our mind in the training process, and I like this book from Bompa, who is a sports scientist, that tried to define an integrated periodization in sport training and athletic development, combining a training methodology, psychology, and nutrition for optimal performance. And this is the important part. And as you can see, if homeostasis is defined as a stability through constancy, and this is not something that can allow us to achieve success in athletes, allostasis is the stability through change. This is the important part, and this is what I would like to highlight, having this different perspective, this allostatic perspective in understanding stress recovery balance. So going back again to the individual and contextual factors and trying to link these individual and contextual factors to injury, we need to go in deep with the individual and contextual factor in this model. And when we think about the injury and think about this part, we can use the Williams and Anderson model of prevention and intervention in injury, because that part is related to the personality, to the stress history of the athlete, and the coping resources of the athlete. So, in an allostatic perspective, so here we have the resources. And this can lead to a stress response, like the one that we saw in the clip, for instance, by Sapolsky. So we can have a psychological intervention to increase the coping strategies, to increase the appraisal of the situation, for instance, and to prevent injury. This is related to individual and contextual stuff. Other colleagues from Sweden, Ivarsson, showed how this model is linked from a statistical point of view in the review that they did in 2017, for instance. And as you can see, so coping do not have a big effect. Also history of stress, not. But the way in which individual provide the stress response can definitely increase the injury or decrease the injury, because our job is to change the stress response to put the minus here, for instance, in front of this correlation. So this review paper, this meta-analysis, provide an interesting understanding of this model combining with the stress recovery model. And as I said just before, stress history of the individual are important. So if an athlete did not have any history of injury, so he doesn't know what happened, and his reaction can be completely different from the athletes that have an history of injury. So, and also here, we can intervene with different type of models. To better understand this stress recovery balance, it is important to have a look to the scissors model by Kellman, in which, so when you increase the stress and your resources or demands are lower, so you have this scissor that increase. So, and it become a problem. If we are here, we can administer training load without any issue. When we are here, we have to start pay attention. Here, we have to change completely our training plan. Or implement strategies to keep the athletes in this area, for instance. So this model is interesting in understanding how stress recovery is combined. And again, recently, in one of the chapters of a recent book that they publish, in the introductory chapter, they provide this stress recovery management. So because you have the external demands, so for instance, training load, external training load, the internal demands, the internal training load, and then you have to work with the stress recovery balance, changing the state of the stress or the state of recovery. So you can work on the interaction, you can work on the stress, you can work on recovery to change this balance. And, for instance, we can increase the stress capacity but reduce the stress response or enhance recovery or other stuff. And here, you can go more in deep in the chapter. You have the biological, emotional, mental, and social dimension. As you can see, 3 constructs about recovery management from a psychological point of view and just 1 from a biological point of view. So think about the importance of implementing sports psychology intervention with athletes. Also, another interesting meta-analysis, sorry if I bother you with a lot of papers, but you can go more in deep, because this meta-analysis is very nice. It is a multi-level meta-analysis of a randomized control trial about the effectiveness of stress regulation intervention with athletes. And what is interesting is that they were able to show the effect size of each type of intervention, and here I underline some of these strategies. So, for instance, biofeedback, I work a lot with biofeedback. I love technology, so, and this is why I underline this one. So, in terms of performance outcomes, psychological outcome, or physiological outcomes. So, as you can see, 3 stars, very effective. So when it is more effective, the stress management, when we administer a first sports intervention or second sports intervention, so immediately or after a period, for instance. In both cases on performance, but not on psychological and physiological constructs, for instance. So we can change the outcome, but we are not able to change the underlying processes, for instance, sometimes. So we have to see what is beneficial in that moment. And how long should be the sessions, for instance? So 1 to 2 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks. So longer intervention do not have any effect on performance, for instance, as you can see here. So there are a lot of different stuff. So summarizing, stress recovery balance is defined as an adequate balance between stress, training, and competition load, other life demands, and recovery is essential for athletes to achieve continuous high-level performance and prevent injuries during training and competition. During training and competition, and we are speaking mainly about non-contact injuries in this case. So, for instance, almost 10 years ago, for 3-4 years, we followed some cycling competition and also some different sports, trying to see how stress recovery balance worked. In this case, in this paper, for instance, we found differences between male and females in the different constructs of stress recovery. This is general stress, so sport-specific stress, general recovery, sport-specific recovery in the instruments developed by Kellman, the recovery stress questionnaire, for instance. And as you can see, there are differences between male and female, and the important differences are here about self-efficacy and self-regulation. This is why in the title I introduce also self-regulation as one of the key points and key terms. But there are differences also between different periods of the season. Because, so if we are in the pre-season, we have a different profile with respect to the period, the in-season period, the competition period. And here you can see a good profile, so low level of general stress, high level of general sport-specific stress, so the general recovery and so on, so on. So this is the good one, okay? But what we saw in another paper, because we were curious what athletes do when they are under big stress and during competition, and we follow day by day these athletes that were competing in a 10-stage cycling competition. It was called Giro Bio. It was the elite under 23 Giro d'Italia. So here we had 200 athletes coming from 20 different countries with the high-level team in under 23. There was the main team, also the French team. There were a couple of also private teams from France and all over the world. And what is interesting here, this is the profile before starting the first day. And as you can see, it is a good profile, low stress, high recovery, low sport-specific stress, high recovery, sport-specific recovery. And this is what happened. So in the last stage, as you can see, it is disrupted, the profile, but it is quite normal. They did 1,500 kilometers in 10 days, so waking up at 5 in the morning, having 6 hours of competition per day, and so on. So very huge demands. And so, for instance, in this data collection, there are at least 90 athletes that now are competing with Giro d'Italia, and the next week they will compete in 1 month they will compete with the Tour de France. So it is very demanding. But what is interesting here is to see where there are no differences between the first stage and the last stage. So when fatigue came and so on. The athletes that they were able to finish the competition had no differences, for instance, in sleep quality, in success, social recovery, conflict and pressure, but particularly here. Personal accomplishment, self-efficacy, self-regulation. So athletes are able to cope with the demands of the training load if they are able to implement this type of very psychological constructs, as you can see. And this is very important. This is why self-regulation is important, is one of the key points in managing this type of stuff. So, and I like the model that was developed by my colleague and friend Claudio Robazza, because it is a very nice model that we used a lot also in the previous model, the multi-action plan model, that is a precursor of this MAST model. So, in which self-regulation is the most important terms when you have the interaction between task, person, and environment, and you can have the balance between the resources available and the demands, if you go back to the previous models. So, the allostatic perspective, this is the main point of the allostatic perspective, for instance. Then you can have a look to the states from an action point of view, or from an emotional point of view. And combining this one with this one, and if you are able to self-regulate your behavior, you can have an outcome that is a successful performance. So this is the most important part. This is why self-regulation is so important in the life of athletes and also injury prevention in this case. So we implemented also other technological stuff, but it is not so important. I like the technology, so I implemented also different type of intervention using transelectric stimulation, biofeedback, neurocognitive intervention, and so on. But all these interventions were devoted to improve self-regulation. This is the most important point. Going to the final part, I have other 5-6 minutes. So we try to go to some more interesting stuff from an intervention point of view. And in this paper, Kellman and colleagues categorize the different type of approaches for recovery: the active, the proactive, and the passive. As you can see, these are some examples of this type, but what is interesting from a psychological point of view is for sure the proactive category. Proactive category because it is related to self-initiated and social activity chosen by individuals and catered to his needs. So here we can, so for instance, detachment, debriefing, all these type of psychological intervention are proactive and very useful in this way. So you have a lot of instruments as a psychologist or as sports psychologist in this case, because here in France we have sports psychologists coming from psychology or sports psychology coming from sports science, but both works in sports psychology, and they studied for this specific point. And also, I want to highlight also this nice paper just published less than 1 year ago, Recovery Strategies in Endurance Athletes, in which I highlighted sleep, relaxation, and rest as 3 main points that I have already cited before. And you will know why I highlighted this type of stuff. Because, for instance, relaxation technique, biofeedback, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, breathing technique, cognitive-based intervention like hypnosis, for instance, so can increase this type of proactive recovery. So we have a lot of different intervention types that we can administer, and we can choose what is well received, for instance, from some athletes with respect to others, because they have their preferences. For instance, it is important to take care or take into consideration this type of preferences. So the relaxation technique can have an inner balance, increase self-regulation, and increase recovery. So this is something coming from a collaborator of Kelma, Pelko, Pelka, which is another German guy that work a lot on this type of stuff. So the relaxation methods, for instance, and here Sylvain knows very well, so when you work on heart rate, blood pressure, finger pulse volume, and so on, you can decrease the first 2 and increase the last 1. Or, from a psychological point of view, you can decrease worrying, anxiety, pain, and increase the concentration and attention in this case. So, relaxation methods are very useful in terms of intervention, stress recovery balance to prevent injury. Again, among these type of intervention, we have recently published this book chapter about the effect of yoga in this type of intervention. And specifically yoga, because yoga, and one particular type of yoga that I'm going to explain you, which is called yoga nidra, can increase sleep quality a lot, for instance. And we saw how in the athletes this can be successful. This is the intervention in yoga nidra. So Sankalpa is a sequence of sentences that the athletes repeat in the evening before going to sleep, for instance, and there are different stages of exercise just for 10-15 minutes before going to sleep, and we saw that this increased the quality of sleep 30%, not 5, 6, 7, 30%. And it is very successful in this type of intervention. And this work was led by my colleague Selenia Di Fronso, who is an expert and a yoga teacher, so she worked a lot in these aspects. And it can increase the personal resolution expressed as a simple, short, and positive sentence, repeated at the beginning and the end of the session, driving the unconscious toward the desired state. The parasympathetic dominance stimulated by the practice may increase slow-wave sleep, improving both subjective and objective sleep quality, and it may improve an athlete's ability to sleep and may be a fertile strategy to address athletes' sleep challenges and debt. So, it is one of the examples that can go. And we implemented very recently, just appeared 2 months ago, this paper, we implemented in karateka. So we work with 4 karateka that went to the World Championship. As you know, when you speak about expertise and excellence, you do not have a huge number of people, so you have to go with idiosyncratic papers. But what we were able to find is that the subjects using the stress recovery balance as an instrument to monitor their state, for instance, had here we reported just 2 subjects, subject 1, subject 2, for instance, so in which you can see the balance in terms of the stress recovery profile when he was working in 3 different moments. So doing different types of training load, for instance, and how the profile can change with the implementation of yoga nidra and can avoid issues. So going to the end, I have just 2 or 3 slides. I think that I'm in the timing, so I'm perfect on time. So I have to thank Alexis, because a few days ago I called him, Alexis, I need some clips, so with French teams speaking about la récupération. So, and I have to thank him because he sent me the movie and I extracted this small clip. And this is the take-home message for the moment, in which you can see how important is la récupération, so the recovery, from the perspective of a physiotherapist, not a sport psychologist.
Un tournoi de rugby à 7, c'est très intensif, c'est rythmé, c'est usant, et quand on bascule comme ça d'un tournoi à l'autre, la récupération fait partie intégrante de la semaine entre 2 tournois.
Psychologists have a lot of expertise to add to this point. This is the point of view of the physiotherapist, so maybe also Del Campo know him very well. So what we could add? What we could add is in the last slide that I use, and I'm going to finish with that slide, because we go back to more clinical aspects of psychology. And we should help athletes to redefine their mindset, because if we want to prevent injury, we need also to teach them how to cope with their life if something happens in terms of injury. And this is the main point.
Placing my identity in God. I have a safe place to be when running or life doesn't work out the way I hope it will. If my best is not good enough, that does not mean I am not good enough, as I am someone who runs, not merely a runner. These revelations made all of the difference for the injury that barred an Olympic dream. I was sad, no doubt, but having found my purpose, I did not force myself to live every day in misery. I let myself smile and laugh. I allowed myself to enjoy things, even though I was not running. By redefining my identity and finding purpose, I redefined my life.
And this is the message that I leave you with my talk. Thank you very much for it.